So, but one of the main criticism which you relate to on the paper on sexuality from dialogues is that the relational the, theoreticians are blamed for excluding the sexual. Why do you think this happened? Why we see less talking about sexuality at this area or in the relational framework? Can you relate to this issue?
Yeah, I think, probably there are many answers to that, and I would be happy to hear, what everybody's thinking. I can tell you from my perspective, it's really a reaction to Freud, right? It's a reversal. It's like we abandon the drive theory, we abandon the understanding that everything is about sexuality, and we go much more towards relationships, love, right? It's a new word we're using in psychoanalysis, love. It was used to be a curse. You can't say love about, right? I mean, if you read the Transference Love, Freud's paper, it's all about how it's all fantasy and it's all right, pathology, and it's all disconnection from reality. You can't use, you couldn't use love as something that describes therapeutic. These days we talk about the power of analytic love, right? But I think what we try to do is try to balance those, because we understand that usually every movement that tries to go against something, usually it finds itself splitting, right, and in a reversal. So that's my explanation. I think there was some reversal, and we're trying to correct it in thinking about sex. And of course, we can also say, which is a little more there is another answer to it, I think, which is a little more pragmatic, I would say, that it is threatening to move into a more related, not blank screen relationships and talk about sexuality, right? It is much more threatening to the analyst and the patient. It is much more hot, right? And as I always, when I teach sexuality, I always start with saying, papers are classical papers on sexuality are not sexy. They're the opposite of sexy. They're boring, they're dry, they're not wet, as they say, And I think the answer is, the reason is because there's a need to balance this, right, to desexualize something. So again, even in writing and talking, and even with me talking with you, right, there is always a little, again, brings us to technique, so to speak. How do we um, how do we monitor what is too much, or also what is too less, what's too wet, what's too dry, right?
If I understood you correctly, you said that since the relational approach is inviting patient and therapist to be closer to each other, it might be the reason for arresting the sexuality, the talk on sexuality, or the.
I do think so. I think that there is it's like, you could see that thing even in our the way we allow ourselves to be bad objects, right? In a more traditional technique frame, if you think about it, was easier to become a bad object. It was easier to tolerate aggression because it was all transference. In our theory, it was all about transference, projections, fantasy, right? So I can sit stable and solid in my seat because it's not about me, right? I analyze the patient. It's about them. The minute we have two psychologists in the room, even aggression becomes more difficult to analyze and integrate, right? Because, okay, now I have to look at myself and see, what about my own bad objects? How my parents sneaked into the room, right? I'm giving you a little preview of dramatic dialogue, right? How do we do that dance party between bad objects, good objects, right? So I think the same is true for sexuality as well. It's not all in the realm of fantasy. There is an actual person here. And if you're actually attracted to me, then it's much more difficult to work with it. It's dysregulating. I think that is
It's also, but Galit, it's also more risky, right? Because the classical analyst, at least he didn't overstimulate his patient because he was more anonymous and he was more natural or indifferent, as Freud said. So that there was less risk in his stance, and it was more clear. The boundaries were more clear. It's not about him; it's about the patient. And especially in sexuality, there is something also danger here.
absolutely, I agree with you. I do think that there was a lot of boundary violation in the classical world, too. It's not like this is a more only relational or new thing, right, about boundaries. I think that analysts in the more traditional technique used to enjoy talking with patients about sex as much as analysts could enjoy now, right? We know that in the historically, analysts used to encourage their patients. The analysts were mostly men, the patients were mostly women. The analysts used to encourage their patients to talk about sexuality and fall in love with them, right? So there is as well. But going back to what you said, I really agree with you. It's much more difficult to work with ourselves, and it requires. And I think that working with sexuality and working in sexuality within a relational frame requires much more strict boundaries. And I'm not even, when I talk about boundaries, I'm talking about obvious boundaries, not boundary violation. I'm talking about time. I'm talking about, something that allows a real frame about money, about, right, all of those things that define to not only for the patient, but for us too, that we are what we're doing here, what our roles are. And within that very, in my mind, sometimes rigid frame, it's easier to dive, to go deep and to go to risky and dangerous places.